Welcome back to World of Hope. You know, in order to remember special events, we do all sorts of things like take photographs, make special books. Others might even write in their journals. Well, for the ancient Israelites in Bible times, when they followed Joshua beyond the Red Sea, they created stone monuments. They piled up stones and gave it a meaning, gave it a name to memorialize that event. Well, Stones of Meaning is the title cover of this week's cover article in the Adventist Review. It's written by Dr. David Trim. And the article outlines significant events in Seventh-day Adventist church history and why people of any faith might mark events in their spiritual journey. Joining me now in the studio is David Trim. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, this article is an interesting one because as I've read those stories about biblical times, it's made an impression on me that even in my own spiritual journey, I need to be marking these type of events. Tell us a little bit about the article.
The article is looking both at biblical history and at the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it looks at biblical history because as Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that everything we do should be based on Scripture. And then having established what the Bible tells us about the importance of history, it then looks at why our own history is important.
Now, why is it important to make memorials like this? Obviously, it was important to God. He had the Israelites do it, and you're advocating that we need to be doing that as well. Why is that important?
It's not necessarily saying we have to be building physical monuments, but it begins with the story of how when the children of Israel crossed the river Jordan, they didn't simply cross. God directly commanded Joshua to have the Israelites take significant stones out of the river and construct a memorial. And the reason is, God says, is so that in future generations, as people begin to forget, your children will say, what do these stones mean? And the meaning is that God brought you miraculously across the river Jordan and into the promised land. And even if we're not going to build actual physical monuments, it tells us the importance of remembering. And that's a fundamental issue that occurs time and again in Scripture.
Now, what type of things do you feel as you look at Seventh-day Adventist church history that we should memorialize today?
There are so many things. You know, one of the tragedies about our history is that even though Ellen White, our prophet, gave us a very clear statement saying we have nothing to fear for the future except as you forget how God has led us in His teachings in our past history, actually that's exactly what we've done very often. There are parts of our history that in effect are now lost. You know, sometimes there's a saying people have that the past is another country, meaning that it's strange and alien to us. Well, if that's the case, there are parts of our history that are forever terra incognita, land that is unknown because we can't explore them and discover them because the sources have been lost. So what I'm saying is we need to treasure our history and we need to be careful about preserving the sources of it for future generations. We hope that Christ will return soon, but we have to act and prepare as though He may not come for quite some time.
Now, I believe you're also involved in this preserving of the history, aren't you? Don't you work here at the World Headquarters of the Adventist Church in preserving it?
That's correct. I'm the Director of Archives, Statistics and Research, and so we are tasked with preserving the institutional records of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I realize that does not sound a terribly exciting job, and you know, one of the largest parts of it is keeping a vault with lots of historical documents. But those documents are sometimes full of insight and are rich. They tell us about people's lives, about the lives of missionaries, the struggles they had, the things they endured, the triumphs they were given by God, and the disasters they faced as well. They give us the record of what our church has done, both its mistakes and the things it's done well.
So you're handling all these documents, but very few people get the privilege of doing that. How can our viewers and people like me find out? I think you have a particular outreach that you open up these stories to us.
We have a website, www.adventistarchives.org, but also we've recently started a Twitter feed. And you can go to our Twitter account, and there you'll get daily updates. Because my office is Archives, Statistics and Research, it's not just archives. You'll find there, for example, significant Adventist statistics, like the fact that in 2010, a new church, Adventist church, was founded every 4.5 hours across the globe.
Fantastic.
But also historical facts. This day in history is one of our recurrent things, and just sort of interesting nuggets of information.
The website, and then you can we can subscribe to the Twitter account.
Exactly. You can follow us on Twitter and get those. You'll also see that Twitter feed, though, on the website.
Okay.
But you know, if people are interested and excited about their history, they can do things. Their parents will leave them historic documents, and sometimes when they die, they'll just throw them away. We're saying don't throw them away. If you don't want to send them to us, and we're not necessarily the best people, but there are Adventist universities, Andrews University, Pacific Union College, Avondale, Friedensau University in Germany. Around the world, there are Adventist institutions that will take historic documents, preserve them, and make them available to the next generation.
Very good. Now, just briefly, your article is running in this week's Seventh-day Adventist World, and there's a part 2 as well. Can you give us a brief synopsis of both, and then we'll invite people to read it?
Part 1 deals with the history of Israel and shows that throughout the Bible, God continually says to his people, remember and do not forget, and make sure you pass this knowledge on to the next generation. Part 2 is about Adventist history and explains some of the reasons that Adventists have been a little bit wary sometimes in the past of studying our own history, and explaining the reasons why we need to, and particularly focusing on that great passage in Hebrews chapter 11 through to chapter 12, which tells us that it is because we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, people from across the history of Israel and of the church, that we can with confidence run the race of faith that ends with Jesus Christ.
Well, thank you for reminding us of that. Dr. David Trimp, thank you for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we want to encourage you to read Dr. Trimp's article. It's online at adventistreview.org. And part 1, as we just heard, discusses the commands given by God, was featured in the June 9th issue of the Adventist Review. And part 2, focusing on the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is the cover feature of this week's review. Again, you can find both online at adventistreview.org. Now, World of Hope devotional is up next, so stay with us.